everybody. In this video I'm going to give a brief overview of the Mills chapters and I'm going to start with the preface and go with chapter 1 to give you a sense of the background of it. So as a literacy scholar, I'm well versed in these kinds of ideas, but I recognize that not everyone is, that this is actually a shift in how people see what literacy means. When we were growing up, literacy meant that you could read written text on a page. It wasn't reading on scribed. For instance, these kinds of things when I was young didn't even exist. Definitely not in the way that they are now in terms of accessibility. So, for instance, my Aunt B, who when she was 90 when she passed away, and her first job was working in a telegraph company. And she went right before she died was learning how to use Google Hangouts. So been a huge shift in how we all interact in the world and how we interact with literacy practices. So the first part, the preface, talks through different ways that theorists and researchers and teachers and other people have tried to make sense of this. So the first shift that happened was with New Literacy Studies. So in New Literacy Studies, this is a way of seeing literacy as social. So here in the social cultural New Literacy Studies movement, which Jim G., the first reading that you have for this week, is actually one of the forerunners of New Literacy Studies. And so the way that he talks about literacy is the way that it has been opening up. So New Literacy Studies is the way that it has started to question the idea that literacy is just about one person looking at and using a brain to interact with a text. It's about how we interact with a text socially. The next move was sociolinguistics, which is what she's talking about with the next paragraph. Then we have the move to critical literacy, which is looking at power relations. How do we interact with the world? Who's able to access particular literacy practices? Who isn't? So for instance, you might be able to access the web on your smartphone, but you can't print a resume. You can't get a job with that. So what does access actually mean with that? Then she talks about multimodality. That's looking at the different modes: image, text, sound, gesture. All of these things are multimodality. That's actually my background, is looking at multimodality and sociocultural stuff, which we'll talk about in the next chapters to come. And then there's a current move to spatiality. Like, what does it mean to be in particular spaces? And doing literacy work. That's what's coming up next. Then she talks about materiality. What does it mean to have particular material practices? What does it mean that I'm reading this unscribed, but I also honestly have a book, a literal actual book in my hands that some of you couldn't access because it takes so long to get here, but you're able to access unscribed or Kindle or whatever. And then she ends talking about with her new theory about sensory. What does it mean to bring our senses together? Then she talks about how this book is organized in the end of the preface. So that's essentially the preface. So you get a sense of what the book is about. Then in the first chapter, she starts talking about globalization, in fact, that children are socialized in literacy practices in ways that we are unfamiliar with. So she says the way that young children are socialized in literacy practices is radically altered when compared with the previous generations. Things are different now. And so that's what we're talking about also in this class, how things have become different. She also talks about how, given how everything is commodified, that literacy is made up of different kinds of commodified forms. The way that we interact with literacy has material texts that move through spaces, and that's important to keep in mind as well with children and with even ourselves in terms of literacy practices. It's about access. It's about who has what, where, and when. She also talks later about people's mobile lives. And what does that mean? And we need to keep in mind that it's not just the use of mobile digital devices to communicate, but the portability of literacies and portable personhood. It's about identity, who we are as we're working through these technologies. So for instance, people who own an iPhone are iPhone users. There's a particular way of being with that and what that means. Okay, then she starts talking about what that means in terms of educational policy, and she gives a case study which basically presents the problem that there's not this that people are not able to move into these newer ways of doing literacy and teaching literacy because they're bound by educational policies that focus primarily and only on print text. And then she ends this chapter with a model for practice. This is the way that it could be done if you focused on multimodality and what that might mean. So that's essentially what this chapter is about. It's looking at how things have shifted and what that actually means when it comes to what's happening in schools themselves. So from this, you will choose a text either here, or you could choose it in the readings if you want for this week's optional readings. So let me go ahead and show you those really quickly and what they are, in case you find them useful. Okay, so this week's optional readings are looking at For Children's Sake, Put the Cell Phone Down. That is actually looking at the detriment, how we as adults are teaching children particular ways of being with that. And then there's a whole section about the maker movement and what that means. It's a new way to see how we can actually use materiality in this new digital age. And then there's a video called Look Up, which is also a take on how we're distancing ourselves and alienating ourselves from one another in this newer world. It's another take on how this globalization is working, how this digital turn is actually working, and some of the issues that can come up with that. So the readings you can choose for your Zotero. The viewing, no. The viewing's just for you. But the readings, definitely, you could use your Zotero entry. One or two of you could do that. Remember, we don't have duplicates for Zotero. So that is the summary for this week's reading, and if you have any questions, let me know. But I know that Mills is dense, that there's a lot of information in there, so choose something that interests you within it, or an idea that's interesting, and find a scholarly article, clear that with me, and you can use that for your Zotero entry as we gather our resources together in a shared resource.